Alright, we're back for day 2. We left off yesterday in a weird spot where I had a script on the main scene for no justifiable reason other than I couldn't find the right stuff on the player. So I fixed that this morning, and now this is working better. All I'd forgotten yesterday was the underscore, and if I change this, you'll see that the overriding indicator here gets removed. So that's all this was that was preventing me from having the player control this. One of this is a bit of a fun kink of the Godot documentation. Godot does not display inherited methods, and there's no way to really find out what you have at your disposal unless you're using self, and even then you'll see constants more than the actual methods. So that was one mistake I made. I did add the process method. I'm not going to use it yet. And my jump method is added. Right now, the only other changes I've made is in this script specifically. My node script is gone. The script I had here last night is gone. The other change here is that whenever I'm jumping, I'm just going to go forward a little bit and have velocity, because we've settled on a theme for this game jam, and it's going to be something to do with a frog. So this is going to mimic the frog hopping. Now it's going a bit too fast for my liking, so I'm going to go and change this. Specifically remove the linear velocity. I don't actually need the linear velocity anymore because I only want the frog to move when I'm jumping. So I'm going to change the speed here. And you notice that this is going. And now the other problem with this is with every jump, the frog is really gaining steam. I'm saying the frog, but it's really a white square for now. So what we're going to have to do before we jump, or after we jump once we collide, is to go idle for a little bit and then jump again. There's one more change I want to make before we get there, just because the only way right now to detect that we're actually touching ground is using a numerical indicator, which if I ever play with the settings in any way, shape, or form, that value might not be the same. Based on yesterday's stream, this was the project settings in the 2D physics. If I actually change from layer 2 to something else, this no longer works. So I'll reuse some code that I have from a previous project. We're going to create a new script with a new folder, and this is going to be helpers. And this is where I'll store autoloads or any other helper classes that will help me do what I need to do here. So I'm going to extend node because that's required to access autoloads, which is slightly unfortunate, but it is what it is. We're going to call this layer helper. And create my script here. We're going to give it a name. So autoload in Godot is essentially the same as the singleton pattern, or as close to Godot's implementation of it. It's not perfect, and there's definitely things that could be improved there, but it means that you get to go and create an autoload class based on a specific script, which I'm going to be consistent instead of introducing this. I'm just going to call my class layer helper, and for autoloads you need to give a specific name to the node. So to not conflict, I'm going to call my autoload instance layer helper autoload. It's now a global variable, and I'm going to be able to access this anywhere in code, and it's going to be instantiated as soon as the game starts. All we're going to add in this is a variable containing the name of the physics layers. And on load, so the ready function, what we're going to do is a for loop If you're familiar with language or with programming languages outside of Godot, Godot does the for statement in a bit of a weird way. So we're going to get the layer name from the project settings. And there's a get setting method. And again, I've used this in another project, which is why I'm reusing this here. Layer names, 2D physics, layer, and whichever number I'm currently at based on my loop, my for loop. And assuming that there's something in that layer name, we're going to assign this to the specific name, and we're going to assign the exact number. Where this becomes useful, and first we're going to make sure we're still able to boot the project without the autoload. There we go. Instead of going for 2 here, I'm going to use my autoload variable and just to make sure I don't make a mistake, I'm going to my layers and I will copy exactly the name that I've input here. And if this works, this should give us the exact same behavior as when I booted a minute ago. And there we go. So now if we need to reach layers using names rather than indexes, this works. And if for some reason I ever make the decision to shuffle the layers around for a reason or another, which is a horrible idea once you start a project, because then you have to adjust that for every object. But now at least I'm getting to the right layer no matter what. This is more useful in case I end up splitting layers down the road and still need to change this. So now we're actually jumping whenever there's a specific collision with terrain. We're jumping, and this is working just fine for now. What we want to do next is, given this is going to be a frog, the frog's not always jumping. We can play with the vector here as we get to it, but realistically we want this to come to a stop. So one thing I want to do is check the documentation for rigid body 2D again. And specifically look into the physics intro and the rigid's body to make sure that I'm using the right tools to actually stop anything from happening at that time and stopping the momentum of rigid body 2D on my collision. Which I'll probably have to do a bit more research on physics to do this properly. What was done for the physics piece yesterday, when I first started, was on the player object specifically, changing the friction and bounce to make sure that I could actually slide on what I was using, but also the linear velocity needed to be set. What I'll need to do is reset impulses, which I'm not exactly sure yet how I'm going to do with physics. The other changes that were done between yesterday's stream is this one. Removing the rotation. And what happens on rotation is that if for some reason the square collides with a corner, the shape, because it's a square for now, would start rotating. And obviously on a rectangle this doesn't have much of an effect, but if you're using a shape that's not necessarily stable, you have the chance that your sprite eventually turns 90 degrees and kind of crashes, and you know, you're not able to do what you want to do with it, or your graphics are just going to look weird. So this is the key changes that were made between now and then, and now at least we're able to validate that this is the terrain layer and not something that's hard-coded. We also took out the constant movement. So now we can make sure that this is actually a jump, but because this is impulse right now, this is constantly gaining momentum and it's not waiting. So we need to stop a rigid body 2D. So we're going to do, instead of jumping immediately, as soon as we're colliding with terrain, we're going to try setting this to a 0 vector and see if this is giving us the effect that we want. See, we're not gaining speed anymore, but we're still jumping. Then what we really want to do here is wait one full second or something close to that. And we're going to pause for a second. I'm used to sleep from other programming languages, but we're going to create a timer here for 1 second, and this should give us a full second of break between the moment we hit the collision and the moment we jump again. Let's give that a try. There we go. So now we're slowly hopping, one step at a time. Now this is not exactly a super impressive hop, but we get what we want here. And this is where eventually this should probably be a parameter on the player, or really at the moment, we're going to build this into a base velocity. Base jump velocity vector. And because we're instantiating this before the object exists, we're going to use the onReady annotation so that this happens before or as the object is getting ready. We're actually going to have our value here. Next thing I need to do for this to work, I need to remove this here and use our base vector, but this is going to enable us eventually to start from a base velocity impulse vector for the jump and add to it. So if the frog for some reason or another in the system actually does a bit better, or there's things to change the parameters, then we can actually jump and jump higher or jump further, or conversely if there's debuffs, jump a bit slower, not jumping as high as a frog currently would, or had gravity scale debuffs or things like that. But then at least we've got a dynamic variable here. We still keep the base version of it, but we're able to change this down the road and add before we actually apply the impulse. I can remove self here, I don't need this. Apply impulse is always going to be the method that belongs to the rigid body 2D unless you're calling from another object, so it's redundant in this case. Self helps me with IntelliSense, specifically find other methods, but again, this is mostly showing me constants, so it's not really helpful. So we're going to run this again. We're going to make sure that this is jumping every second, and there we go. And it's still using a bit of a low velocity, so we're going to give our jump a bit of love. Actually, I'm going to make the jump go further than higher for now and see how this looks. That actually looks a bit closer to the movement that a frog would have. There could be interesting ways to change this where you're randomizing and seeing if there's weird ways to make the frog move. Either you're going higher on some jumps or not as far forward, but for now this should work. Now the other thing that I'm going to change, and this is starting to annoy me as I watch it, so I can only imagine how for a player this would be very problematic. We're not going to need this platform. I'm just going to rename this for now. The other thing that's really starting to bug me for now is the camera following exactly how the player is going. And the position of the camera is also fairly challenging, because realistically I want this to move a little bit. I want this to be in a slightly different spot. I also don't understand why I've got a player node here. Get rid of that for now. So I want my camera to have an offset. And since this is 1920 1080, what am I looking at here? Something in the 500s. There we go. So this doesn't address the shaking. This is going to be something to do with the y-axis. Interesting. Why is there a problem with the auto load? Not quite sure why that changed, or what caused me to not have this variable available, but that's actually really weird. Alright, does this fix the issue, or do I still... There we go. So now I'm a bit closer. I still got some room with the camera offset to actually tweak this a little bit and be closer to the bottom. So we're going to keep bumping this up until the only thing we should be seeing is the absolute bottom of the screen. So we still have some room to change this here. Let's do -500 and see what this looks like on the main scene. 500's a bit much. We're gonna do 475. That's still probably not the right call. 450 or 425 should be correct. This is gonna at least enable us to see the platforms underneath. And it also gives us something where we don't need to make a huge platform or tile map for this to be visible. This is also more than what I thought it would be in terms of the change. Yeah. So I'll have to investigate why there's an issue with the camera there specifically. Camera shouldn't have collisions enabled, so this should not be a problem. Then we're going to look at changing the drag, or either the position smoothing. Because we don't want the top scroll. or the top and bottom once it goes up. So we're going to try giving it a bigger margin here and see if that fixes it. There we go. This is exactly what I was looking for. Now we only need to adjust the viewport and the screen, more specifically the player and the camera, so that it's following the platforms. But I'm not sure if this will address it. No. I'm wondering if it's because my resolution is higher than this specifically, but it should be scaling this up. There we go. So it's because my resolution is bigger, it's giving me bigger viewport. Now this looks closer than what we'll be to what we'll be looking for in terms of the jump. We're not going to move the camera up and down every time the frog jumps. For anyone with simulation sickness, if you've ever been dizzy playing a game, usually sometimes it's with some of the things that's happening with the cameras. We also got a glimpse with the corner of the lack of rotation. So once I hit the edge here, normally with physics on, the shape would start rotating. So I can use this to show it. You'll see the shape start rotating once we reach the absolute end of the platform here. I'm not gonna lie, this is making me regret the stuff I picked. The platform size. I'm not sure why it actually did not. Is it because I didn't save? It should have saved on load, but try to see if there's a better way for me to show this. But let's see what happens if we start from here. Do I actually hit the corner? Right, it's because I'm stopping the velocity. So normally, if you're hanging around like this, your shape's going to start rotating, except that we're stopping any velocity from happening, which by default will disable the duration while the shape is still able to hang. So I'm going to put the player back to my initial starting point, save this again, and now we're pretty much where we want to be. Now that I was changing this on the camera, not the player, that's why. Lock the rotation. Maybe I can show it again now. This is the fun thing with a live vlog. If you mess up, you'll know immediately, but you don't take it out of the video like a proper vlog where you're just looking at the action after the fact. Yeah, there we go. So my rotation started happening. So to disable this, it's a lock rotation property in deactivation. And now your shape's not going to rotate, which means if you got a collider that's a capsule collider instead of, or a shape that's capsule or circle shaped instead of a square, these are more prone to the rotation, and this addresses that problem. Now there's going to be something else to add, and we're not going to finish this during this stream. I do need a cursor at some point. We're going to change the action so that instead of the jump being triggered by the spacebar, we're eventually going to add an aiming component. So we're going to call this shoot cursor for now. And this will be where the frog is aiming to try to shoot its tongue out and catch a bug. We're going to need to add a collision shape, or probably a polygon, but for now we're going to do shape. And this is going to be a capsule shape 2D. And we can rotate this about 45 degrees if we assume that the frog's tongue would be shot about a 45 degree from the frog. And by setting my position specifically for 256 pixels, I'm roughly 4 times the width and height away from the frog. I may end up playing with this a little bit. And what's the warning here? Oh yeah, because we need the area 2D. So for the tongue specifically, unlike the player and the terrain, we don't want this to be a collision object, so a shape or a rigid body. We actually want this to be an area 2D. Because with physics enabled, objects are either going to push each other when they collide, or if there's a static body, one object's going to move, one is not. So what we're doing here is going to be creating an area for which we need collisions, and this is where the layers are going to start coming into play. But areas collide differently than colliders. You notice with the nodes that you actually see shapes entering or exiting the area, or the other areas are entering, exiting each other, which trigger the signals that you need to hook up and take the actions that you need if you're hooked on these signals, if you have a signal handler. So we're going to use areas because, unlike physics, I actually want my player to stop when he's hitting this, but I want the tongue to be able to touch whatever target it's trying to get to, and then for actions to happen as a result without the two objects colliding and potentially something being pushed away from the frog sticking out its tongue. So this is where the area is going to come into play. And because I don't actually have a design for now, it looks really weird to just have this collision shape. But that's roughly how this would be implemented. We're going to go and change the project settings and go back to the 2D physics. I'm going to add enemies, and I'm going to add a player hitbox. And this is going to differentiate. It's going to give me a different layer to be able to play with in terms of what I want this to collide with. And for now, this does nothing. This is just moving one step at a time. And I don't have collision boxes on in debug. And now the other interesting thing is that the only thing that's actually moved in terms of the transform is the collision shape. The area is still over here, but it has a specific collision shape. So we could play with this and have the area all the way over here, loosely the whole object or the collision shape. But because this is likely to be an extending tongue, what we're going to probably end up doing is have an initial shape that's with the frog, wherever the frog's head is, and have to extend towards what's going to be where we're colliding at that point. So I'm using this as an example, but the likelihood is that we're going to generate these objects at runtime, and whenever we're trying to catch a bug based on a moving target, we're going to create the extending tongue up to a specific distance and then bring it back. This is going to be what we're continuing to work on over the weekend. For now, we're going to end the stream. Follow the stream if you've enjoyed it. This is also going to be available on YouTube. We've set up the channel as well. It's on the stream links. So if you need a VOD more than 7 days after, you can go to our YouTube channel to watch it. Thanks for tuning in, and have a great afternoon.